Okay, well, welcome everyone. Welcome to our guest today. Welcome to the WIP committee. Welcome to all the CACOR members who have joined us. And welcome to Mamphela. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. And this meeting is the fourth meeting in a series that we started with the committee. And it was a series to look at limits and beyond and Earth for All. The committee really felt that these documents were very rich and contained important elements, ideas, practices, and tools that would be of interest to our committee, and that they would also be able to provide us with valuable input in our work. When we consider the impacts of climate change, the content of these reports can help us formulate our perspectives on specific issues and give support to what is being done and can be done. We sent out a background paper for this meeting. And of course, the first section was a summary of the 7 chapters we selected from both of the core documents. And we also sent the agenda for today. The third part of the background paper will be the focus of our meeting today. When we were doing our analysis, we came up with questions and comments we felt needed to be elaborated on. So, and we thought would be also, given that all of these series of 4 meetings we had were discussion meetings, we really wanted to delve into how our members felt, and we were really looking for their contributions around the issues that came up. So this part 3, what we've done is we've got 14 questions, and we've kind of group them together, and so we really will have like 2 questions and 3 questions together because they're a little bit on the same theme, and then we'll open it up for discussion. And if you want to participate in this discussion, I would suggest that you go to the bottom of your screen, and where it says reaction, you can press on that, and then there's a possibility of raising your hand. If you would just press that, and then it'll be easy to see who wants to discuss that particular question or has a comment on that, and we'll just go from one to the other. If at the end of this you have other questions, then I would recommend that you put those into the chat box, and we will go to them at the end. And right now, to begin with, we are really happy to have with us Dr. Mamphela Ramphele to give us a starting talk. She has looked at our summaries, and she will comment on these, and also give us a little more of the Club of Rome perspective on what we've we're focusing our studies. A lot of you know Mamphela. She gave CACOR a keynote speech for our AGM in 2019, and many of us know her from participating in some of the Club of Rome activities. So welcome, Mamphela, and I'm going to ask Fernand, co-chair of this committee, to introduce you to the rest of the group. Fernand?
Thank you very much, Madeline.
Fernand, we can't hear you. You're muted. Art, can you unmute her?
Here, I'm unmuted.
Okay, good.
Okay, thank you. Well, Dr. Mamphela Ramphele has played a major role in leading South Africa out of apartheid and providing a vision and a way forward for South African society. She was born poor, and her first ambition was to become one of the few women doctors. At university, she founded the Black Consciousness movement with the famous nationalist Steve Biko. and was active in protest movements against racial segregation and injustice. She has published extensively on poverty, women's empowerment, and citizen participation. She is a remarkable person through her life experience and through her reflections. She's been recognized on the world stage, receiving 23 honorary degrees. As co-president of CACOR, she brings knowledge and wisdom and to lead the way for an inclusive and equitable adaptation to our world and the climate is where the climate is requiring us to change our ways. She has many accomplishments, and I will focus in on, she's been on her activism, her academic contributions. In 1992, she was vice chancellor. She became the first woman vice chancellor at UCT. She was one of the 4 managing directors at the World Bank. She chaired Economic Development Company, and she was voted in 2018 as president of the Club of Rome. And from that position, and with her co-chair, Sandrine, they have proceeded to lead an exercise that reconceptualizes CACOR as a catalyst and a platform for transformative change. We are very inspired by you, Mamphela, and your focus on the emergence of a new consciousness, the importance of that emergence. So thank you. We're very honored to have you here. Thank you for assisting.
It is my honor to be welcome to this, one of the most active Club of Rome chapters. You have demonstrated your commitment to making sure that you stay on course, you raise the tough questions, you do the work that needs to be done. Mine today is to react really to your paper and the questions that you have raised. So I will do so through the perspectives of women, because that's the essence I got from your paper. These were perspectives of women in the context of global inequity and planetary emergencies. It is striking that a global environment designed by men to the exclusion of women, with a patriarchal, hierarchical, and inequitable governance system, could have expected to produce anything but inequity and planetary emergencies. Human beings were created to be interconnected and interdependent within the web of life. The wisdom of our common ancestors that has been devalued, discounted, and marginalized is happily being revisited by many a scholar and many institutions in both the public and the private sectors. Women in indigenous communities were and are still largely treated as the keepers of the seed. The seed is not only that of life, of both humans and other lives, but also the seed of wisdom. Women more than men understand and in their daily lives enact the interconnectedness and interdependence of all humans within the web of life. Early feminist voices failed to understand that liberation of women cannot be fully realized without the liberation of men, who are the ones who place obstacles on the paths of women to realize their full potential, to express whom they are in this amazing web of life. The initial hesitancy of women, particularly from most of the world, who opted, instead of labeling themselves as feminists, they've opted to say we are womanists. Others from my part of the world who say we are womanjas, and still others call themselves Afro-feminists. And this was largely due to the tendencies of the early feminists to ignore the intersections of race, class, and gender in their analyses and practices. The issue of power relationship is front and center of what we as women should engage and transform. The Club of Rome's own history reflects the patriarchal assumptions of the time. The Club of Rome was a male club in a city of Rome, which was best known for its long imperial history. Donella Meadows, who did most of the work on the publication that ended up being The Limits to Growth, was good enough to use her brains, but not her voice, including not even acknowledging her as the main author of The Limits to Growth. A similar incident happened elsewhere in the US, in what has been now showcased as the silent faces of the NASA moonshoot, which was widely acclaimed as the work of the president who encouraged people and the men who went to the moon. It's only recently that gradually the three exceptionally smart Black women, led by Katherine Johnson, who virtually was the mainframe computer. They didn't exist at the time when they were doing this. And she could compute the difficult orbiting configurations that you couldn't do without a computer. But when it finally happened, she was not acknowledged. So let's now take that as the background against which we are going to address the questions that you put to me for our conversation today. I took the questions and grouped them in my own mind into 4 sections. The first being Indigenous wisdom, the second, collaborative skills and leadership, the third, desirable features, and finally, what kind of Club of Rome do you want to see in the 21st century? So let's start with Indigenous wisdom. Carlos Alvarez Pereira, who is a great friend and colleague in the Emerging New Civilization work that we are doing, in the book that was published in celebration of the Limits to Growth's 50th anniversary, Limits and Beyond, asks, and I quote, "How do we move to more desirable futures by daring to question how we think about the world, our role in it, and the relationships among humans with life and with time?" The response to Carlos's question lies in your question to me from my article in F for All, in which I suggest that there is a need for all of us to become indigenous again, with community-based systems that would be inspired by local production and consumption needs. So the phrase, human beings need to become indigenous again, is not coined by me. It came as a retort by an Australian indigenous leader who was labeled the keeper of the Uluru. The Uluru is what is famous, the red rock in Australia. He was responding to Liz Gorrison, who was saying, given so much wisdom that you have, how can we as human beings do things differently? So he didn't say, well, do 1, 2, 3. He just said, you've got to find a way of reclaiming your indigeneity. All of us are indigenous people. So how we might move to more desirable futures requires us to become more daring. We need to dare to question how we think about the world, how appropriate our roles given that thinking, and how do we manage and nurture relationships amongst humans and our relationship to life at large and our relationships with time. Indigenous people have over millennia held on to their science and wisdom despite being humiliated, dispossessed, and their science and technology devalued as not science, but indigenous knowledge at best or superstition at worst. Imagine what the world could look like if we were to accept that we are a relational species that has no capacity to develop into its full flower without being in relationships with other humans within the wider web of life. In my part of the world, in Africa, we were taught in childhood that a human being is human only in relationship with others, or in isiXhosa Sauti, umntu ungumntu ngabanye abantu. Human beings, the essence of what it means to be human is something that connects us. One cannot be human alone. One is only human through one's relationships with other humans. So indigenous science and wisdom acknowledged or understood this very early on. And therefore, it does not admit to the absurdity of superiority and inferiority of people on the basis of the color of their skins or the shape of their features or their bodies. Racism was created by the patriarchal systems to justify enslavement, colonial conquest, and dispossession. Racism is not only morally reprehensible, it is anti-science. Indigenous people became victims of their own generosity because they didn't recognize the white people who came from wherever as anything other than human. So they treated them as they treat all strangers, with generosity. And that made it easier for them to be colonized. In a world where indigenous science and wisdom reigns, stewardship of our ecosystem is practiced as a way of life. I noticed that you refer frequently to how the Canadian government is working with indigenous people. The question is, how is the Canadian government learning the way of life of indigenous people and embracing that in its policies and practices? Because there is much to learn. Africa is not only the cradle of humanity, but also of the first human civilization. And it was able to live in harmony with the ecosystems that it has bequeathed to humanity across the globe. Ancient wisdom teaches us that one takes only that which is needed, not that which is wanted. Sufficiency is the watchword in ecosystem health and is tied to ensuring well-being for all. Overconsumption and greed are indicators of emptiness inside one's soul. Substitution of healthy human relationships with material consumption is what has led to the planetary crisis we face today. Climate change, pandemics, conflicts, and ecosystem damage, including the precious sacred resource of water, which is estimated by the Global Commission on the Economics of Water that produced a report a few weeks ago at the UN called Turning the Tide, which is online. You can find it on my website. The estimate is that if we continue to consume and use water in the careless way we are using it now, by 2030, we will have 40% shortage of fresh water. So I leave you with that. Second area, which embraces some of your questions, is about how do we promote collaborative skills and leadership that is collaborative. You base your questions on Petra Kunkel's promotion of a feminist worldview with a regenerative civilization that can only succeed if we reimagine and reinvent leadership as enabling others to self-liberate in order to become powerful agents of transformative change. Indigenous communities that have remained rooted in their wisdom excel in promoting collaborative work. If you come from rural areas like I have, women as the keepers of the seed and the connections that women make to multiple generations remain the best able to sustain and mobilize collective efforts. In good and bad times, feasts and celebrations, deaths and funerals, the ingenuity and mutual support of women come to the fore and keeps the wheels turning. This is very important because a lot of women, when they assume positions of leadership, demonstrate the same patriarchal, hierarchical tendencies that they decry in their analysis. Let's turn to the third area, which is about desirable futures. The attainment of more desirable futures demands reimagination of what is possible. We as a global community have lowered the bar against which we measure our expectations of ourselves, of our families, of our communities, and our societies at the national and global levels. If we are to remain true to the essence of being human, then we would have to be able to understand the importance of creating the conditions for enabling each one of us to liberate ourselves from the prisons of our minds and souls that those prisons have locked in our minds and souls. We need to throw away, open the lock and throw it away. The superiority and inferiority complexes stemming from racism, sexism, and class positions in our hierarchical societies are impeding our ability to bring the best versions of ourselves into conversations about our shared futures. And I would like to quote Elinor Ostrom, the 2009 Nobel Prize winner in economics, who concluded that governance of the commons would require rethinking of current models of governance. And I quote, designing institutions to force or nudge entirely self-interested individuals to achieve better outcomes has been the major goal posited by policy analysts for governments to accomplish for much of the past half century. Extensive empirical research leads me, that is Eleanor, to argue instead that a core goal of public policy should be to facilitate the development of institutions that bring out the best in humans, which means creating conditions that liberate our minds and souls from the prisons in which they are held. The development of such institutions would start with conversations that build trust between human beings. In African culture, such conversations take place within a circle. And we have brought into the Club of Rome the concept of the Ubuntu learning circle, wherein everyone is equal. We sit at eye level to promote eye contact and connections at a deep level. Ubuntu circle conversations are where we meet as human beings, just people, not Mamphela the doctor, the president, no, Mamphela the person, and connect at a deeper level that then engenders trust relationships that make for easier collaborations and higher impact and effectiveness of our efforts. Aurelio Pichet, the founder of the Club of Rome, learned the hard way that despite the limits to growth selling millions of copies, like the Earth for All is doing right now, and stimulated a lot of discussion and activities, that is the limits to growth, it did not necessarily lead to the systems change that Pichet yearned for. He then reflected on this and coined the phrase, the human gap, which is the gap between what we know and how we act despite that knowledge. Disastrous outcomes of our behaviors come from not ignorance, but from mindsets that are unwilling to shift in the light of the information at hand. Pichet championed what he called a human revolution in his last book, published in 1984, called Before It Is Too Late, which he published with Daisaku, who is a Buddhist monk. In their view, what is required is creating spaces, such as the Ubuntu circles that I was referring to facilitate not just communication between the people in the circle, but quiet time to reflect, to travel inside each one of us, to liberate the best versions of ourselves from those prisons in which they are trapped. Insecurity, fear, greed, and lack of self-confidence. Success that we see in Bhutan with a move away from GDP as the sole measure of progress has come because of individuals taking responsibilities for actions towards progress. This progress came from leadership that is enabling of all to travel inside of themselves. They actually create national time for meditation to bring their best version of themselves into the process of reimagining and rebuilding their country. The process also allowed Bhutan to reimagine what is important beyond the traditional measures of progress, such as GDP. So the happiness index measures well-being because as human beings, we are at our best when we feel loved and in supportive relationships that bring us joy. This is all common sense. If only we were to return to the essence of what it means to be human, or as the Australian elder will tell us, become indigenous again. Finally, what does this mean for the kind of Club of Rome for the 21st century? The Club of Rome in the 21st century is called to be a catalyst for change towards global equity for a healthy planet. This requires that each of the 140 or so full members and the many more associates such as yourselves in this room, working at national or regional levels, we need to work together, guided by this vision of global equity for a healthy planet. As this presidency, we are in the process of developing a strategic framework to enable a better environment for reimagining ways of working collectively at all levels to contribute to the futures we would like to see in our world. The collaborative process we started as the co-presidency in 2019 after our election was built, as you said earlier, Marilyn, on the idea of the Club of Rome as a platform that recognizes that its many, many members bring diversity of talents, experience, cultural diversity, as well as geographic backgrounds that are really exciting and important in this reimagining of our future together. The platform we have built consists of 5 impact hubs that have now become actively engaged in tracking what we call the arc that connects planetary emergencies, which are upon us now, and the emergence of a new civilization that we are dreaming of. In between, we have reframing of economics, rethinking of finance, but without the vision and that arc that connects them, we'll all be very busy, but there won't be a real major progress made. And so the idea was to also re-establish healthy relationships with time. Human beings have become so short-term in their views, forgetting that we are here because our ancestors, millennia ago, invested in the future, their future, which is our present. And therefore, we need to follow in their footsteps to make sure that the present that we have is transformed into the future we can bequeath to our grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Too deep an engagement with emergencies saps the energy from the creative space for emergence. And so we have to keep our eye focused on emergence whilst dealing with the current emergencies. And I think that's the challenge that the Club of Rome has to confront and will be judged by history for either success or failure in that endeavor. I thank you.
Wow. Thank you very, very much, Mamphela. That was just amazing. I'm really happy that this is the approach you've taken to talk to us. You've touched on most of all the questions that we've had there. There's probably what I'm going to recommend that we do is not take questions right now. As I said, you can put questions in the chat box, but I think we should continue with what we had in mind, which is to look at these questions, because again, because when Fernand will do number 1 and number 2 of the questions, that follows well with parts of your presentation. And I think what we'll then do is, if people have any questions when dealing with that particular, basically this is the number 1 and number 2 talk about Indigenous groups, and particularly in Canada. So I think we will click into what you just said about in Africa, but when we discuss it, when Fernand presents it, then we can open it up for discussion. And then if there are specific questions that people have for Mamphela or for Fernand about this, or want to discuss some other aspect of it that they think haven't been touched upon, then this is the discussion we will have. We have about 50 minutes for discussion now. So I think, given your presentation, Mamphela, a lot of the background information and the way that you organize the questions, I think it really will give us, it sort of gives us greater scope, really, when we're answering these questions. So I think we'll just proceed as we had thought we would. So I'll ask Fernand to read the 2 questions that she was looking at, and then make a few comments, and then we'll just open it up. And then, as I said, press at the bottom of your screen. We have something called reaction, and raise your hand if you have if you want to participate in once Fernand has finished, you want to say something. Okay, Fernand?
Well, without reading word for word the questions, I would, in response to Mamphela, who says we should all become Indigenous, I would say that there is, in the past 10 years, that the thinking, there's been a new respect for Indigenous thinking, and that it has permeated it worldwide, and that a lot of the new economic systems that have been thought up are based on circularity, on reuse, and so we have been embedded now by this thinking, Indigenous thinking, and that in fact it is the cornerstone for a change of consciousness. It is the basis for rethinking new approaches. And so but that's at one level. But to go back to the first question about, the role they play in Canada, that is still, at the consciousness level, things have changed, there's respect. And I would say that I'm reading from many points of view that we are all Indigenous people of the planet. So that recognition means that this is not a homogeneity. There are different groups with different worldviews, different approaches, and they all need to be respected. And they don't want to be lumped. We have so many different groups in Canada and in the world, and they're not to be lumped together. And then my question is, with the participation and the recognition of Indigenous wisdom, and also their know-how, how do we join? How do we join with that at the practical level? Because there's also the feeling that here in Canada, it's a bit gone overboard in some cases. Some people have claimed Indigenous heritage and then later been stripped of their academic positions because they, in fact, were not of Indigenous ancestry. So that it's getting played out that, that there is a need to respect the integrity of the different groups. And how do we reach, how do we support, how do we join without co-opting is more like a question that's current in Canada. And there's so many ways that it's happening, and there's so much participation on the disappeared Indigenous women and the joining at large with Canada. So it is happening. There's lots of ways to join, and it is happening. I guess with your wisdom, how do we join across these groups and yet respect the integrity of these groups while showing the respect? I know at a principle level, it's easy to say, but in a concrete way, there are little struggles that are being played out.
Do you want me to respond as people ask, or
Yes,
we wait?
yes, please.
Well, the thing is, if we accept the premise that there is this invitation for all of us to become Indigenous again, not in the co-optation mode, but the invitation is to learn from our Indigenous roots. Because whether you accept it or not, you are all Africans. So you're not co-opting, you're not claiming something you are not. Of course, if you do it in a way that is intended to access resources that are intended for those who had been excluded before, then you are a fraud and you deserve to have your academic qualifications stripped. But emulating what is good in one culture doesn't mean that you become of that culture necessarily. We learn French, we are not co-opting French, we are broadening our base of knowledge of languages. In cultural terms, we also learn dances, like, for example, Latin American dances, which I don't know how to do, but it's elegant, it's inviting. And doing that dance doesn't mean that you are claiming to be Latin American. So I think the issue is not whether or not we engage with Indigenous cultures and practices and so on, but the motivation behind it. What's motivating you? Just simply claiming, embracing, or as Eleanor Ostrom invites us to do, to learn from others so that you can show up with the best version of yourself. You'll never change who you are, but you can have the best version of yourself by learning from others.
Yes.
We have a question on Bhutan. I don't know if someone could answer that. That's from Barry Bruce. Does Bhutan have a thriving local food system, or does it import a lot of food, commodity crops? Is regenerative agriculture used locally? So I don't think, I'm not in any position to answer that. So we'll move on.
I don't know that either, but I think you can Google and find out.
Yeah, I think so. And we'll move on to Mike Nickerson. Can you state your question, Mike?
Okay, well, thank you for the reminder of the Indigenous connections to all of us. It's a divergence from that led to the consumer culture. As we developed machinery to mass produce things, we were transformed from citizens into consumers so we could clean up after overproductive machinery. Project I work on, we're trying to encourage a return to the capacity we have to enjoy living and having that as the focus of life rather than the accumulation and consumption of stuff. I'm just wondering if you see that sort of thing. We condense it into the phrase more fun, less stuff. But I wonder if you could comment on that.
I just love that. More fun, less stuff. People are happier when they're not chasing this consumerism. But unfortunately, it has become such a cornerstone of progress that, I mean, the consumer price index, everything is about if people are buying more, then the economy is healthy. Really now? So we as members of the Club of Rome have to unmute our voices in these matters. And exactly what you have put in the chat box, Mike, you need to be saying this more and more and more, because what economists continue to teach our kids at university is poisonous stuff. And they're not doing that because they don't know what you know, but somehow it's like Aurelio Piche talked about, the human gap. The gap is that they don't want to be the first ones to jettison the old style economics. And I just think that we have, as the Club of Rome, after presentation of those 5 hubs, committed to reframing economics and rethinking finance. How are we doing this in our everyday lives as scholars, as practitioners, etc.? Because quite frankly, here in South Africa, we have a failed government, and we just pray and hope that people will wake up next year when we have a general election. But the people who have opted out of this corrupt, incompetent system and gone back to their roots to produce food, to have healthy food systems, are thriving. They're thriving in rural areas, even though they are not leading luxurious lives, but they are leading lives of enough or sufficiency.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. We'll move on to numbers 3 and 4. And again, this brings us back to Dr. Petra's Guenko's article, and she challenges us to promote collaborative skills. You've talked about this, Mamphela, and I think I think it's very, what I got out of that is the importance of working together and having, you talked a lot about what Armstrong said about the having people get together in groups and meetings in a circle and discussing these things, and in that way we can develop together collaborative skills together to get something done. I think that was one of pointing towards one thing. The other thing was you also brought up the her developing a more feminist worldview, and in her article she talks a lot about the old our older societies. First humans on the earth had a more sort of like a more egalitarian look at between the sexes, and women were given a special position. And in her article, she brings in a lot of these symbols to enforce this. It is one of the things were the mindsets that she brought up that we have to sort of try and deal with. And I wondered if we could talk just a little bit more about shifting mindsets, because I find that comes up in many of the questions and many of the articles. So if you could just talk a little bit more about that. And also in, again, Carlos's great sentence there about daring to question how we think about the world. I find that particular statement from Carlos really deserves a lot. That could be a whole discussion in itself, is how do we dare to think about the world and our role in it? Because I think everybody would bring a different view of how that should be done from their background. So I guess for these two questions, if you can just talk a little bit more about collaborative skills and particularly shifting mindsets, because I find that's really a difficult thing.
You know, the Club of Rome and all of us in our various roles spend a lot of time doing consulting work and or training people to become consultants. And what are they going to do? They're going to do exactly what Eleanor Ostrom said, makes no sense. which is to try and convince turkeys to sing for Christmas and to celebrate Christmas, which is exactly what we are doing. I mean, trying to convince people whose mindset is patriarchal, hierarchical, consumerist. We spend a lot of time as people desiring to see change on policy advice and analysis. There's nothing wrong with it, but we should recognize the limitations of policy advice and policy of being able to convince people to change the policy stances that they have. Which brings us to the issue of the best performers, whether they're in the public or the private sectors, are people who have gone through what Aurelio Piche calls the human revolution, which is really about stopping to say to yourself, who really am I? What are my strengths? Am I performing my daily tasks as a woman, as a family member, as a teacher, whatever role you are playing? And the answer, of course, is going to be no. So you're going to have to confront the things that are those prisons that are keeping your mind away from the daring, the willingness to collaborate, the openness to other people's viewpoints. So mindset shift is not something mechanical. It is a process of coming into the best version of yourself by recognizing that all human beings are inherently good, and that the goodness within them is often undermined by fear of being different, by lack of self-confidence. And let me give you a practical example of how this mindset shift works. And I'll ask you to go after this into your website and Google Leap Schools. Leap Schools were started by a man who is now a member of the Club of Rome, John Gilmore. Some of you know him. There's nothing magic about the Leap Schools. Their main focus is on that self-liberation, which is what leads to mindset shift. Now, how do they do it? In the South African school program, there is something called life orientation, which is a real great concept, because we often walk into life without stopping to think, gosh, where am I going? But this life orientation in the curriculum has become the distinguishing factor, the unique value proposition of the Leap School model in the public school system of South Africa, which is badly underperformed. We underperform Malawi with the lousy amount of money that they devote to education. We spend as much money on education as many middle-income countries, but our results are scary. And what does John Gilmore do? Every day when young people come into the classroom, and they come from, these schools are in the worst areas, the slums, the neglected townships, and so on. Every day starts with people sitting in that Ubuntu circle. They don't have desks in their school. They only have round tables. So kids sit 7 or so to a table. They get to work together. They become, that's teaching collaborative skills, but starting with how do we collaborate to find out who we really are? These kids come from abusive families, dirt poor families. The first few weeks are really, literally, they are trying to help these young people heal from the trauma of their environments. And how do they heal? First of all, who are you? Most of the kids have got English names, which is the legacy of colonial conquest, one of the deadliest legacies, to say that African names are not Christian names. So if you want to be a Christian, you are baptized, you've got to have an English name. How iniquitous, but that's what it is. So John Gilmore starts by getting the kids to reconnect with their real names, which in African culture, names have a lot of meaning. And once these kids know, wow, I'm light, I'm this, I'm that, they start sitting up. And of course, it's mutually reinforcing because they are in a circle, little circle. By the end of the first quarter, those kids have stopped whispering. They found their voices. They don't longer walk crouch like that. They are walking because they have found out who they are. It's a long process. It starts they get to admit these kids in grade 8. By the time they get to grade 12, they are doing math on the higher grades, science on the higher grade, Indigenous African language on the higher grade, English on the higher grade, and they outperform. They get 98 point something percentage pass for their school, compared to the actual pass rate in the South African schools is under 25%. Did I say any more? I don't think so.
Jean Dougherty has a question, and she says, do you think we have enough time to make the mindset shift that needs to be made?
There never is not enough time. Today is the time. If you start today, and I mean, I have to keep working at it. I'm now 75. I mean, South Africa would not be free today had we not had the mindset shifts of, we were called non-Europeans, non-whites. Can you imagine?
Yeah.
People come from Europe, take your land, take your everything, and in the end, even take away who you are.
Yeah.
And the day we woke up at medical school as young, and we were in a medical school which was designed for non-whites, non-Europeans. So it was called the University of Natal Non-European Section, right? And we used to call out, yeah, I come from UNNE, okay? After many weekends where we would sit together and ask the question, how is it possible that a country in Africa with 90% of the people, in fact, more than 90, it was closer to 98% of the people not being European, can be compliant to a regime that is clearly humiliating and undermining them for so many centuries without being able to get together, talk about collaborative efforts to chuff these people off our backs. But we couldn't do that for as long as we called ourselves non-Europeans. It's like, you know, women who, to show that they're successful, they'll wear pinstriped suits. They're done, right? You cannot emulate your oppressor and be free. Part of mindset shift, part of self-liberation is really celebrating who you are. Fully woman, fully African, fully whatever. I'm now 75. I love being 75 because I've done the work to get here. So really, there's never not enough time. You can change wherever you are today and do things differently from how you did them yesterday and last year.
Mm-hmm.
And all of that adds up to a momentum for change.
Thank you, Mamphela. That was very profound.
Thank you. I will move on to number 5 and number 6. And again, about the success in Bhutan, I think also when I read that article, Anne will talk about this, but one of the things they did say in the article was self-leadership that you get through this particular approach to life. And I think it falls in very well with what you've said, but I'll let Anne start.
Thanks very much, Madeline, and thank you, Mamphela, for introducing Bhutan and their happiness index and their new way of approaching economic management in the country, which has brought the country out of poverty. And it is, I believe, the first country to actually be carbon negative, the first country globally to actually go that way. The paper written by Julia Kim on Bhutan and beyond raises a lot of issues beyond just what has happened in Bhutan, or it did for me. Taking a step away from the gross national product and gross domestic product, I find those economic terms and those economic thoughts are incredibly patriarchal, in which we measure the progress of the human race based on economic grounds. And perhaps, as we move to the future and we start to make basic changes in our systems, we should be starting to think about measuring our progress in a way that actually measures where we want to go, not where we've been in the past. I would like to kind of direct the conversation that way, in terms of what are the ideas, what are the dimensions of measurement that we would need to measure a future society that would be a successful society, and that would reflect the thoughts of women and the perspectives of women in terms of success, as well as the traditional economic approach to success that we've had and has got us into this mess in the first place. Thanks.
Yeah, you want me to respond?
Yes, please.
The Carlos talks about we need to reimagine our relationship with time. And the first colonizers, when they came to the African continent, concluded that Africans were lazy people. They're always sitting under a tree. Now, they were not sitting there because they had nothing to do. They were at work. They were doing the work of connecting, building trust, checking in with one another, how things are, and planning. They plan in a collaborative way. And so the relationship with time is important in more ways than one. And you are also mentioning how GDP measures what happened, but also what happened in a very narrow field called economics, which is a mismeasure. There was a famous book written by a famous scientist called The Mismeasure of Man, which was about racism, saying that Black people's brains are smaller than white people's brains. But here we're talking about the mismeasure of progress. You can't reduce human endeavor to such a narrow focus on something called GDP, which is derived from economics. But it also measures, as you say, it's a patriarchal measurement tool that measures the production of arms. The more arms you produce, the higher the GDP. So is that a good or bad thing? So I don't have for you an answer that says these are the measures we should use, but I think what we should be asking ourselves is, what is it we want to measure towards, as you said? If we are measuring towards well-being for all, then you know what well-being means for you, and therefore what it would mean for everybody else. Then you can be able to look at how we're doing in terms of access to the basics of life that support life, including water. We'll have to look at what happens in terms of access to human settlements that are not just houses, but settlements, which provide ecosystems that make us feel proud of who we are, which is how our ancestors, they didn't have double-story room or houses, but they lived in and amongst nature in a way that reinforce this idea of being together. Because when you go out camping and you try and sleep under a tree alone, you are dead. But if you are in a group, you are protected. So there was a way in which their lifestyle reinforced all of the values that were important about what it means to be human. And so that's well-being. Then we also talk about a healthy planet. You know, the Christianity has many sins, one of them being that we were created to be overlords over nature. What kind of distortion is that? Because we are part of nature, we are part of creation. So the more we are paying attention to the well-being of everybody with that sufficiency approach rather than overconsumption approach, the healthier our ecosystems are going to be, because we'll only take what we need, not what we want, and not waste water. I mean, I often tell people the story of which is captured by one of UCT's top academics who's looked at the relationship between the ecosystems we are in and the quality of human relationships. And she relates the story of the first settlers, the Dutch, who came here completely, in fact, on the verge of death because of scurvy and living in very unhealthy environments on those old ships that they came in. And the indigenous people here didn't say, these people don't look like us. No. They embraced them, fed them with fresh water, vegetables, fruits, etc., and they recovered. So when they were about to leave now, the indigenous people did what you do when your guests are leaving, you give them provisions for the road. So indigenous people here in the Cape where I'm sitting and looking at Table Mountain, they drank water from the Table Mountain springs. But before they take water away from the springs or they fetch water, they thank the spring for this water and promise not to waste it. And then they fetch it. And so there is a way of affirming the value of water as a source of life, and therefore to treat water as sacred. But what they saw when those Dutch people were filling their tanks was sacrilege. I mean, they would fill the tanks and then pour water over themselves. I mean, how do you do that? But it's a different mindset from the indigenous mindset. So going back to the first question, how do we become indigenous again? At least, for God's sake, learn good manners from the people who are hosting you.
Thank you.
Okay. We'll move on to number 7 and 8. And in this one here, it's again coming back to, this is in Earth for All, and it's coming back to the stewardship and protection of the commons. And we're coming back to the idea of the commons. In 2013, CACOR hosted the International AGM here in Ottawa, and that was our theme. And a paper was produced, and to those who were part of the meeting, I have sent that article that was written for the background paper for that conference. But in it, in Earth for All, there seems to be an expansion of what we mean by the commons. It's not just like the parkland or land. It has a bigger notion. It goes into digital commons, and of course, you know, with the internet and I guess even with the AI chat box now that comes into play. There's also human DNA. And that's also, who does that belong to? It's sort of because everybody has, a lot of people have had their DNA looked at. It's in a
Is it me?
based on the RNA, so that again, you know, so the notion of the commons is a somewhat larger now, and I might even add space. So does in what you've seen about the talk around this at the Club of Rome level, is this being am I interpreting this right when I read chapter 8 that they're looking at this?
Absolutely. But as you say, it's tucked away there, but it's not necessarily engaged with.
Okay.
I showed you this report by the Global Commission on the Economics of Water that I sit on. And in that, the core message of that report, which Robin Ann will send you what do you call it, a link to the report. The core message is that the water cycle, not just water, but the water cycle is a global common good. So the commons, quite frankly, is how indigenous communities, they treated everything as the commons.
Yeah.
So you couldn't, so the tragedy of the commons that was muted happened when consumerism said, the more cattle I have, the more Where I grew up, both my grandparents on my mother and father's side were farmers, and they had substantial numbers of cattle, goats, and whatever. But it was always kept within the boundaries of the carrying capacity of their land. And if you were caught over what's grazing your cattle or sheep or whatever, you would be fined because you are undermining the commons. Because if you overgraze, everybody else, it will become a race to the bottom. So the idea of the commons is part of the wisdom of our ancestors. And if we think about it in those terms, whether it's space, whether it's DNA, whether it's this, because yes, your DNA, if we were to track it, as I did, I did a genetic mapping something like 30 years ago. And I discovered that I come from Nigeria, the Hausa people in Nigeria. And by coincidence, I met some women at a conference who said, "You look just like my aunt." So yes, we do share DNA in ways that we can't necessarily track, which means it goes back to what I said right at the beginning. We are interconnected and interdependent. So the commons, it's a beautiful term. If you could just think about everything that we love, we wish for, is part of global commons. Water, space, the forest, the trees, the water, are all part of what. So part of the perversion that has come into our way of life in today's world is privatizing the commons. I live in a country where my ancestral lands were colonized, were dispossessed. We were dispossessed of our land. But in the name of public or private property, when we did the transition in 1994, farmers who had land which had been stolen from the indigenous people, unless there was a way of settling and getting reparation of that land, they got to keep the land and the water that runs through it. But to add insult to injury, our constitutional court ruled a month or so ago that the farmers can trade in the water. I mean, such sacrilege. But that's because the concept of global commons has been narrowed down to parks and whatever. It was never intended to be that.
Good. All right, I'm going to leave my next questions, which was what would it take to set up a coalition of the willing? I'm going to keep that for question number 11 when I'm looking at tools and that we can use. So I'll move on to Fernand, who wanted to talk a little bit about the Canadian refugee situation. So Fernand?
Yes. In Canada, we are very open to immigration and have accepted refugees, but it's usually presented with economic models. It will create jobs. It will grow our economy, and the people who come to Canada tend to respond to that by showing how hardworking they are and successful. But there's another reality, which is that they come with a lot of trauma behind them. And they come here because of this trauma. And so it's very, and there's many institutions in Canada to welcome them. And those institutions that do sponsor them and welcome they're at an individual family levels, et cetera. And that's where there's real sharing happening. And I think it's important to recognize and talk about these stories because they come to us with a gift of being so resilient. And we need to hear the stories. And what's been very interesting is that the children of these immigrants are now producing a literature that is very realistic about their experience. It's a very rich vein of literature, which is feeding into Canadian literature. And I think listening to the stories, listening to, taking that in enlarges our circle of empathy. And what we need is to enlarge that circle of empathy when we're talking about interconnectedness and interdependency to a global level, to a bigger level than just our group. So I see that this is such a gift in Canada that we are getting this gift of people coming, but we need to listen to their trauma. We need to share, we need to learn.
Yeah, but here's the thing, there's been a big move. I've just occasionally looked at the media and found that there is a resurgence of people demanding that there be acknowledgement of the history of slavery,
Right.
colonial conquest, etc. Because, you know, it's tragic that in Africa we have people dying trying to cross into Europe because Europe has become so anti-immigrant, and people are dying, and they're largely young people. So enlarging the circle of empathy and caring requires acknowledgement of how did we get to where we're, right? The Brits were the biggest slave owners. And you know, the tragedy is that when slavery ended, the slave owners were compensated for losing property.
Right.
And part of the trauma that you see in the refugees is what neuroscientists call multi-generational trauma. You get traumatized because a lot of those people were Africans who were shipped across, and many of their ancestors died in unacknowledged deaths. Now, no one is saying, let's sit and do a calculus, a balance sheet of who owes who what. But just simply, if I have trampled on your very sore toe with a corn that's painful, if I just say sorry, you feel better already. Acknowledgement. And I really like this thing of this system you have instituted now of storytelling, because when people tell their stories, they reclaim who they are. And the wounds that are festering inside have an outlet. And hopefully, those stories will also help the rest of Canadians to start asking the question, where did these people come from? How did we Canadians, because most of you who are Canadians, they were British people who were beneficiaries of this British Empire, or victims, depending on what your attitude is. You still are part of the Commonwealth and the British realm. So it's part history, an acknowledgement of what went wrong, and we can't change that. But we acknowledge it and make peace with it. We tell the stories of how that has affected us so that we can heal. And then together, collaboratively, we fashion, we reimagine what a future of interconnectedness and interdependence could look like.
Yes.
Okay, we move on to number 11. There are many models and tools and inside in the articles that we read in Limits and Beyond and in Earth for All. There are many principles, set of principles. They have, there's the system change compass that Sandrine talks about. And a lot of those things are really interesting tools. A few years ago, CACOR did a really wonderful session using foresight, which again is another kind of tools to help you understand various sides of an issue. And I was wondering, would it be, it seemed to me it would be a good idea to start one of these sessions using these tools, but not do it just with Canadians, but maybe we could try and work. I don't know if the Club of Rome would be interested in doing any of that, but that would also help to give perspectives from everywhere in the world. The 21 articles that were in Limits and Beyond, you had people who contributed articles from all over the world. The one that took me the longest to understand was the Chinese one. And I had to go to some of my Chinese friends to try and get a bit of tradition and background on these these ways of seeing things. So I think it's very rich. And I just wondered, is there a possibility of doing that? I know you have hubs now. I know you have papers that dive down deeper into Earth for All, that we can go and look at some of those papers that have been done. But is that a possibility of having some kind of a Zoom meeting where we do what we're doing now, and we from all over the world get to contribute but following a particular format? Let me just take, for example, Danella's 5 principles of how you look at what you do, what you invent. She said, like, if you're using natural resources, don't use natural resources only to the extent that they can be replenished, and never use non-renewable resources. And she has these 5 principles. I mean, we could look at whether we should have electric cars by using this principle. It would be really a great guide for us how to behave in terms of our approach to various issues. So I was just looking at the possibility of doing that. And to come back to the other question that I didn't ask about, this would go along with setting up a coalition of the willing. Before you had talked about, CORE working with about 140 people who are members now, and then working with associations that are Club of Rome associations throughout the world. It's again an idea of both of these things come to collaboration. So and on a particular using a particular tool, and some of the tools that were put in your 2 reports.
Well, I think the first thing I would like to caution you about is that there is no right way of doing things which is universal. One of the things I did a few months ago at Carlos's urging was to write I think it's 1.5 page paper on the power of language. And in that, we also referenced a paper that we did as the African region called New Narratives of Hope. One of the dangers of having a club that is so diverse, and yet with the tradition of Western dominance, is that we can fall into the trap of just continuing with things because somebody has said them, or not questioning, as Carlos urged us to do. Now let's take the issue of what you are saying is the other principles that we can live by. Yes, principles are there for you to look at what is valuable in this. It's like indigenous knowledge examples we're using. But for example, the systems compass that Sandrine produced, it was produced in the context of Europe. I can't take that compass and think that I can go and apply it on the African continent. It shouldn't make sense, because on the continent, the governments that we have that are not working by and large are because we try to produce replicas of governments from Europe. The departed colonizer model of governance is not appropriate for Africa. And so I would caution against looking for a set of principles by which we live. Donella Meadows died when did she die? About how many years? It's almost 20 years.
Yes,
okay?
20 years. Yeah.
Right. The world has changed since she died. And she was a woman who was always thinking ahead. By the time she died, she was talking about dancing with systems, no longer principle 1, 2, 3. And she talks about it, that she had this tendency when something happens to just say, these are the principles. But in the end, she realized that, like music, you go with the rhythm, not the individual notes. So yes, by all means, let's learn from her wisdom, but let's not try and live by principles like the Bible. The Bible was fantastic for the time it was written. There are things in the Bible that I can't agree with, like, for example, women must respect their husbands. What about the husbands respecting their wives? So I'm just putting those cautionary tales there. And finally, this issue of coalition of the willing, that's what the Club of Rome is supposed to be, just that. And this idea of a platform is not where people are forced to look at economics or finance or emerging new civilization or planetary emergency plans. You look at what in your environment, and given who you are and what you're doing, what makes most sense. And then you then can say, what can I learn from Bhutan or learn from whoever? And the CACOR is a coalition of the willing, because you are all doing different things and you come together. You are not replicas of one another. You are not biscuits that have been cut off the same cookie cutter. You are people with a diversity of views and so on, as long as our values reflect our understanding that we are interconnected and interdependent, and that the vision of the world that we would like to see emerge is a world where there is global equity for a healthy planet. The inequities that we see that have led to the war of Russia against Ukraine, they didn't come because Russians were hungry or Ukraine was, whatever it is, doing anything that provoked. They came out of a mindset, a Soviet mindset, that unless I am controlling you and what you decide, you can't be free. I mean, the same thing with the US used to have that attitude. So Latin America, it was treated as a kind of backwater where only the people that they approved of could be presidents and so on. You must ask the Chileans for, if you want to listen to that. So I really think that we should not want to create a kind of structured way of responding, because what makes the human race exciting is its diversity. But what would make us live in a world which we feel comfortable is shared values that take away these ideas that there are different races, they're different. No, we are one race, one human family. We look different, but we are one human family. And for as long as what I do does not undermine your humanity and your ability to thrive and to have well-being, then I should be bringing that there to enhance, to create color like you do in a garden.
Thank you. I know we'll go to the last three, which is again about the Club of Rome and CACOR, and I think you've answered a lot of that, but Fernand, do you want to add more on that?
Well, I will just, at a large level, I agree that we work from where we are, we question from where we are, we build our reality, and we share that reality with others. And that's what I was trying to say. We have experiences here in Canada where we are building the new consciousness, and we should be talking this language more. And we are on the cusp of a change of mentality over, our control of nature, our domination of nature, to a recognition that we are part of all the Earth's ecosystems. And just to leave on a concept of hope is to know that consciousness can change quite rapidly, as has been the case with the Me Too movement, which happened with such rapidity. And that in part is due to the social media. It's a good aspect of the social media. But when people started to reflect from where they were, their experience of sexual harassment, then it exploded. It happened in Paris, it happened in organizations, it happened in institutions, the army, governments. Everybody started to talk about and feel the license to be able to address it, and it changed. So the consciousness changed. And the social science is saying that, you know, if you only have 10% of a population that believes strongly in something, it can shift. It can actually create a very quick change of consciousness. And I feel we're on the cusp of doing that here in our, and, you know, fed by Indigenous and fed by all these different points of view. And that's what we're building, and we're building from where we are located and need to share those stories.
Fantastic. You should just keep at it. I see there's a question, the Commonwealth a help or a hindrance? How can it help? Well, the reality is that the Commonwealth is a way in which Britain keeps tabs on its former colonial holdings, because you cannot have something called a common where only one country can be the head of that commons. It's not a commons, right? It's a mirage, which helps Britain retain influence over colonies it no longer controls. But it's a neo-colonial platform for continuing British influence in the world.
Mamphela, there were there are two questions and a few comments, if you don't mind taking another 10 minutes. The one is from Gabriella, and that was what she wanted to know was at the beginning of your presentation, you talked about women you mentioned that women's perspectives and respect cannot be had until men are liberated, and she wanted to know about how do you go about educating men in this way?
Well, we are the mothers of every man on earth. How are we bringing up our sons in a way that helps them to know that they are not superior to women? And how do we treat them as opposed to how we treat our daughters? So we hold the key of how do we model gender equality in the home, in the institutions where we are, and in the communities where we are. And that is critically important. It's the same thing with regard to racism. South Africa, for example, still has racists running around. Why? Because the government that is incompetent, after 30 years, they continue to use the same so-called population groups, perpetuating a falsity, the absurdity of different groups of people. And so if you believe in that mindset shift, the self-liberation, the freeing of the best version of ourselves, it's got to show through in everything that we do. And when we do that, because freedom is indivisible, you can't be free as a woman and unfree as a Black person, or unfree as a man, and you say that I'm free, but your behavior towards women and children and other people who don't look like you belies your freedom. You are not free. You are still in the prison of racism or sexism or patriarchy or whatever, share that. Be so pleased with yourself because it's so much nicer to live in a world where you are truly defined by your relationships with everybody, every human being and everything in life.
There have been some comments that were put on there about, some resources on the Center for Victims of Torture in Minnesota, and also another one on slavery, African United, and the other one was Victims of Torture, and the other ones was Minnesota's African United helps by African immigrants settled while retaining and expanding their connections with Africa. This was put forward by Claude. Claude, did you want to add anything else to that?
Not really. I just wanted it to be part of the chat, and
Yeah.
I think that Dr. Ramphele would enjoy looking at that. And Basil Ajuo is the executive director of that organization, and he's pretty well connected with Minnesota politics. So it's just
That's
part of your
fantastic.
network. Okay, very good.
Yeah, wonderful.
And
Well,
and then there's Ted who made a comment on that tomorrow there's a CACOR Zoom meeting, and it will be on the issue of human biosphere relationships and how to change the dialogue away from personal economic gains to the concept of a definition of well-being. So I would encourage everyone to be part of that. And I would like to end by saying thank you very, very much, Mamphela, for your generosity, for preparing for this, and also for answering our questions and helping us discuss a little bit these areas. There was a lot there, and there certainly is a lot more in the books. And I think the last chapter of Limits and Beyond, if you look at what Carlos has written, I find it very philosophical, and he really, there's just too much there to discuss. But I think we started, and I know that our committee will continue to look into this. We're going to write a final section for our background paper, and this will be presented to the CACOR board, and we will also send you a copy, Mamphela, for of this report. And from this report, we will also next year, we'll be getting ready for preparing our next year 2023-24 Women's and Perspectives Issues Committee, what we plan on doing. And I know that what came out of today will be some of the steps we will follow through on, and we'll share. If it's we will send some of these things to you. So just for your own personal knowledge of what we're doing, we want to keep you in the loop. Is there anything? Is there anything
I
else?
will send my notes. Robin Ann will send my notes tomorrow to you.
Oh, thank you.
And use them for whatever purpose.
Oh, thank you. And Jean?
Yes, on behalf of the Canadian Association for the Club of Rome, I would like to thank you for the length of time that you have spent with us today discussing this, and also all the time and effort that you put into preparing this wonderful presentation that we had today. And thank you, Madeline and Fernand, for organizing this on behalf of CACOR. This particular talk has been recorded and will be made available to people on our YouTube. We will send you the link to this and the chat that is accompanying this. So all of the information that you have provided for us today, as well as what we provided to you, will be available, and you can use this as you wish. So again, thank you very, very much for what you've done today. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you all. I'm very, very proud of CACOR as the president of the Club of Rome, because you really model what can be done if people at the national level, the regional level work together to we won't solve all the problems, but we can at least ask the questions. And I think that's what you're doing. And I thank you very much for doing this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.